So, you want to get into survival horror. Seemingly infinite ammo and regenerating health just isn't doing it for you anymore. You've played your fair share of multiplayer FPS and now it's nothing more than a mindless grind. You need something more grounded, gritty, and tense. You want a video game that'll remind you how alive you really are. A game where the odds are stacked against you right from the beginning, and one wrong move may be your last. Well, you're in the right place. In this video, I want to take you through the genre of survival horror, providing you insight into the key landmark franchises, modern additions to the genre, and my own personal recommendations. We'll take a look at what makes them all similar, what makes them unique, and why they may be your best entry point into this fantastic genre. With that being said, let's dive into the dark world of survival horror. Whether or not you've played a single survival horror game, I'd be willing to bet that you know the franchise Resident Evil. A now roughly $9 billion franchise, Resident Evil has earned its place as a household name, spanning from movies, books, and of course games. With the release of Resident Evil 7, fans of the franchise were excited to hear that Capcom wanted to reel back the ludicrous levels of action seen in previous titles, particularly Resident Evil 5 and 6. They instead decided to take inspiration from their roots, looking back to a time where resource management, tank controls, and spine-chilling horror was king. I'm of course talking about the 1996 PlayStation 1 release of the original Resident Evil. Resident Evil 1 is a great starting point as it popularized and defined the survival horror genre. It would be the game you compare to any subsequent survival horror game you play afterwards. You'll be able to play both older and modern games alike and pinpoint the influence taken from Resident Evil. Common themes that games still borrow from Resident Evil today include item management, puzzle design, and backtracking, just to name a few. That being said, Resident Evil 1 is an old game, and while some aspects of the title remain timeless, it does still show its age. Tank controls in particular may pose a challenge to newcomers of the genre. You won't be able to move and shoot at the same time, and fixed camera angles may be hard to manage, as you'll have to get used to maintaining your intended direction while camera angles abruptly switch depending on your location in-game. And if you're picky about graphics, well, the PlayStation 1 stands no chance against modern releases. However, that's where the 2015 Resident Evil HD Remaster comes in. This HD Remaster is an updated version of the 2002 Resident Evil Remake, released on the GameCube. This remake modernized the game, added new content, and let returning players experience the horrors of the Spencer Mansion all over again. This version of the game also introduces an alternative to tank controls, providing more accessible movement for players who are interested. I would say, if you're not some sort of chronological purist that has to start where it all began, feel free to consider the Resident Evil 1 HD Remaster as a valid entry point into the genre. Though I'm not saying don't check out the original, both titles are fantastic games to play, and whichever version you choose, you'll probably want to play the other for comparison anyways. There is one thing to say about Resident Evil, however. The first game, particularly the original version, is notorious for its horrendously delivered dialogue, adding to its oh-so-campy B-horror elements.
Stop it! Don't open that door!
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right. Barry, thanks for saving my life.
While this may give you a chuckle during your playthrough, I know some of you would rather avoid this altogether. So if you're looking for an early entry to the survival horror genre while avoiding any semblance of laughter or happiness, then it's time to look at the cousin of the Resident Evil franchise, Silent Hill. Released in 1999 on the PlayStation 1 by Konami, Silent Hill 1 is undoubtedly a great entry point into the survival horror genre. While Resident Evil has a scientific research gone wrong approach to horror, Silent Hill takes a psychological approach, freeing itself from the limitations of the real world and allowing the player to take a step into the darkest portions of one's mind. As a result, Silent Hill 1 presents itself as the gloomier, lonelier, and introspective counterpart to Resident Evil. Just like RE1, you'll have to manage items, backtrack, solve puzzles, and pick your battles. Though you may find yourself running away from enemies in Silent Hill purely out of fear rather than simply item conservation. As for the puzzles, I would say that they are miles ahead of Resident Evil's puzzles in terms of difficulty. They're real head scratchers, and I can only think of one puzzle in RE that even comes close to the complexity of Silent Hills. Similarly to Resident Evil, Silent Hill is a great starting point to survival horror as it is easily followed up by the following games of the franchise, especially now as the Silent Hill 2 remake is finally out. However, if you want to play the earlier games in their more original form, your best bet without emulation is the Silent Hill HD collection. This collection, released on the Xbox 360 and PS3, comes with both Silent Hill 2 and 3. Be warned, however, this collection is collectively hated by a large portion of the Silent Hill fanbase, as it is regarded as a horrendous port of both titles, messing with the game's visuals, soundtrack, etc. However, if you've never played the originals to begin with, which if you're watching this video there's a chance you haven't, then you may find yourself having no trouble with this collection. At any rate, the first 3 Silent Hill games are absolute classics of survival horror, and worth your time exploring if you want to familiarize yourself with the genre. With the early heavy hitters of survival horror out of the way, let's jump forward in time and see what else the genre has to offer. Nowadays, as the art of game development becomes more and more accessible, it's no surprise that indie and solo developers alike have taken their shot at producing wonderfully horrific titles. The creativity shown by fans of the horror genre shows no bounds, and certain titles that have been released in times that surpass their inspirations are certain to satisfy your taste for survival horror. One example that immediately comes to mind is Cry of Fear. Believe it or not, Cry of Fear is actually a mod for Half-Life 1, and ended up winning the Mod of the Year award in 2012, a testament to its competent game design. Its first-person perspective puts you in the shoes of the main character, something we haven't seen among the titles we've discussed so far. Cry of Fear also differentiates itself through its sheer depressive atmosphere, incredibly uncomfortable audio design, and focus on suicidal themes. I have no doubts that if Cry of Fear was a music album instead of a video game, it would be DSBM. Everything from the mindset of the protagonist to even the healing animation just screams pain and loneliness. Cry of Fear is quite lengthy as well. My first playthrough took roughly 20 hours, and believe me, if you manage to pull yourself all the way through, you'll breathe a sigh of relief by the time those credits roll by. This is the most accessible game discussed in the video so far, as it doesn't require anyone interested in playing to get a retro console or some $300 disc that's bound to rot someday. This is one of those games that you'll remember for a long time, or even never forget, which says something about the game's deliverance of tension and horror. For these reasons, I highly recommend any fan of horror to put this on their video game bucket list. Another modern survival horror game on PC is Lost in Vivo. Compared to Cry of Fear, this game is shorter and arguably less intense in its portrayal of mental illness. But that's not to say that the message it tries to give the player isn't profound, it's just more subtle in the delivery of its message. I'll also mention that this game does stray from the mechanics of the previous games mentioned. There's no backtracking, and your health actually does regenerate. However, you're still not going to go around every corner dumping ammo into a group of enemies at any point. Just like Cry of Fear, the game offers some extremely tense moments, and fans of Silent Hill will recognize its influence spread throughout the game. It's also free, so there's really no harm in trying it out. As we near the end of the video, the last game on this list I would like to mention is Nightmare of Decay. This title is yet another free game on Steam, and a worthy addition to the survival horror genre. Nightmare of Decay is a direct homage to Resident Evil 1. You'll immediately see the inspiration taken from the game as you explore this very familiar looking mansion. In Nightmare of Decay, you'll face your typical zombies, abominable boss fights, and you'll even encounter enemies that are clearly inspired by Resident Evil 4 as well. Playing this game is like taking a step into an alternate timeline where Capcom released Resident Evil 1 as a first-person survival horror. I hope this video was helpful in guiding you through the dark world of survival horror. There's a lot of games to pick from these days, and it might be overwhelming to pick just one. You only get to play your first survival horror game once, so it's worthwhile to try to make the experience a positive one. While compiling this list, I wanted to make sure that anyone watching could pick at least one of the games on here, so I made sure to include titles that were completely free and readily available on Steam. However, this really is just the tip of the iceberg. If you've heard of these games before, or none of them really clicked for you, I encourage you to keep exploring to find out one game that convinces you for good. Until then, if you made it this far in the video, thank you for your time, and I'll see you again soon.